you know anything about me and the shows we've run here on Just Add Monsters, you can probably tell I love video games. New or old, good or bad, I love them all, but having been born in 1995, I wasn't always able to play as many as I had heard about. This is where emulation comes in. Every now and then I like to peruse old games with the help of emulation. In the past, it's allowed me to connect with bygone curiosities like Sweet Home on the NES, among other games. But I've recently come across a variety of ports and entries for popular series I never knew existed, which sent me down a strange rabbit hole to find as many as I could, play them, and show them to the world. And I'm not talking about popular spin-offs on handheld like Zelda or Mario, I mean the more bizarre, esoteric games like Splinter Cell on the Game Boy Advance. But that's getting a little ahead of myself. To kick things off, we'll have to go way back to the weird and wild game industry of the 1990s. It was a different time for gaming, when Sega, that's the Yakuza and Sonic people for all the Zoomers out there, had their own share of the console market.
Sega Genesis gives you more real villains, hot graphics, and killer two-player action. Genesis. It's a whole lot more.
Nintendo licensed Mario and Zelda games to other companies, although not for long for obvious reasons.
You've got to be kidding.
And Mortal Kombat had a stage play. The game industry was basically the Wild West, a new, untamed frontier with almost no rules. But there seemed to be two rules that were steadfast. One being that sex sells, and the other being that there will always be ports of successful console games to underpowered handhelds. Which brings us to Tomb Raider.
Let's do this.
Yes, ma'am.
It's hard to understate just how popular Lara Croft was as a character in the 90s. While the console game sold well, her status as a sex symbol appealed even more to spin-off media like two early aughts live-action movies and a host of very late 90s comic books. But one aspect of Lara's legacy that's often overlooked are the two Game Boy Color games that would bear the Tomb Raider name. In fact, these two games would lead to a handheld gaming legacy that followed Lara's adventures all the way until the franchise was rebooted in 2013. And the strange thing is that played back-to-back, the handheld Tomb Raider games across the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and Nintendo DS feel more cohesive and attached than the console Tomb Raider series that spawned them. And not every game was even a port or an attempted port of a console title. There are a couple games in here that are entirely original adventures for Lara, limited to handheld systems. But just how well did Lara's death-defying, high-octane, and, well-equipped console adventures translate to handhelds like the Game Boy Color, Advance, and Nintendo DS? Well, let's find out. While the first Tomb Raider game launched in 1996, it wouldn't be until 4 years later that Tomb Raider would hit a handheld with the self-titled Tomb Raider for Game Boy Color. While it bears the same name as the console game, it is in fact an original adventure that sees Lara trying to stop a group of treasure hunters from finding an evil stone that can unleash a demon goddess. So, fairly standard Tomb Raider stuff. The game was developed by British studio Core Design, which had actually cut their teeth on earlier Tomb Raider games like Tomb Raider 3 for the PlayStation. So they already had a passing familiarity with the series. But how exactly does one translate one of the biggest action 3D games of the 90s onto what is essentially a glorified NES? Well, kind of by breaking all the rules. While it might not exactly look like much now, Tomb Raider on the Game Boy Color actually impressed a lot of critics when it came out because of its sprite-based animation. See, to accurately portray Lara's form, Core Design basically doubled what is supposed to be the regular height of a character on a Game Boy game, making her about 48 pixels high. They really made it twice as tall so you can see her boobs jiggle on a Game Boy Color screen. They also packed in more than 25 moves, including being able to backflip, roll, shoot, and jump in all sorts of different directions, which helped to maintain the animation-heavy feel of the first game's platforming. And there's actually a ton of animations in here, and they're all really, really smooth, even by today's standards. In fact, in my research I found that there was over 2,000 frames of animation, so it's no wonder why people praised this at the time for being as smooth as it was. Unfortunately, like most of the old Tomb Raider games, it is kind of hard to go back to. When I first picked it up, honestly, I thought it was garbage. In this 2D platformer game, you don't actually have a jump button, you have a run button. And if you want to make a long jump, you have to hold the run button down long enough and then move diagonally on the D-pad, which will send Lara hopefully flying towards a ledge or someplace she can safely land. And much like the original console games, if you don't take the right amount of steps or give Lara enough space, she'll just kind of fall face first into a wall. This led to some unintentional hilarity in my first couple of minutes with the game, but as I got used to the controls a little bit, I found that it actually might hold up better than those original PlayStation Tomb Raider games because of the axis you're playing it on. The weight of the animations actually gives it kind of a Prince of Persia feel, and through the magic of emulation, I don't really have to worry about some of the game's more frustrating checkpoints, which I could only imagine would be infuriating had I actually played it on the original system. But between the massive amounts of animation, the smooth gameplay that does take a little bit of time to get used to, and the story that's told in fairly impressive static screenshots, I can definitely see why this would have scratched a Tomb Raider itch back in the 1990s. There wasn't anything really like it on handheld, and you can definitely tell that the team put a lot of work and effort into making this style of gameplay work on such an underpowered handheld. Unfortunately, the combat is much less inspiring, though the game does give you plenty of health packs scattered all around. I will say the worst aspect of this game has to be the level design. But thankfully, that was all fixed in the sequel. 2001 would see the release of the next Tomb Raider handheld game, Tomb Raider Curse of the Sword, again designed by Core Limited. While at first this game kind of felt more like an expansion pack using a lot of the same sprites and assets, it's actually a pretty big improvement and one of the better games on the Game Boy Advance towards the end of its life cycle. There's some really beautiful sprite art and work here, the level design has been simplified and made more accessible to Lara's moveset, and her gameplay has been tightened up, making this the best way to play Tomb Raider on a Game Boy Color, I mean, if that's something you're interested in. There are also some pretty cool and unique levels for a Tomb Raider game, including one in New York and a standout level later in the game set in New Orleans. Honestly, I've played this game for a couple hours, and though I haven't finished it yet, it really is a shame this sub-series was completely forgotten about on the Game Boy Color, because this game kind of rules, unironically. In tightening up all the loose ends of the first game, they've made a game that is fun to play and go back to in a way that not a lot of the early Tomb Raider games are. It still has some frustrating checkpoints, and you will occasionally jump to an accidental death or to damage you didn't intend to take, but honestly, a game bearing the Tomb Raider name on Game Boy Color, especially given some of the other ports of console games like Turok, has no right to be as good as this. If you have the ability to track down a cart or a ROM of this game, I'd fully recommend checking it out. Just make sure you keep your save states handy. The next game in the Tomb Raider franchise would be developed by Ubisoft? Is that right? Is that right? Okay, the next game was developed by Ubisoft for the Game Boy Advance in 2002, Tomb Raider: The Prophecy, yet another original Lara adventure. This one's a little bit more top-down, but I actually still had a lot of fun with it. It actually kind of reminded me of the Lara Croft spin-off games that were put on Xbox Live and PlayStation Network a couple years back. The combat isn't exactly anything to write home about, and the puzzles are usually just hitting a switch and then progressing to the next area, but it does have a lot of really good atmosphere, and the climbing and platforming works pretty well for as small of a system as the Game Boy was. It's not really pushing any polygons or anything on the Game Boy's tech department, but it's a really solid entry that does kinda capture the essence of a Tomb Raider game from a new perspective. The game was kinda criticized at the time for being really repetitive, and as a curiosity, I must admit that I got kind of bored of it in about 10 to 15 minutes. But during those 10 to 15 minutes, it felt good to run around in that world as Lara. The story is also nothing really to write home about. If you've played a Tomb Raider game from this era, you've probably played all of the stories. There's a bad guy, there's a MacGuffin, and Lara has to jump on rocks and shoot indigenous wildlife to stop them from getting to it. But still, as an experiment in how to bring this formula to the Game Boy Advance, The Prophecy is a really fascinating, interesting game, and I think the fact that it's developed by Ubisoft, who doesn't really do licensed work anymore, is an interesting little bit of gaming history. People forget that Ubisoft wasn't always the big Assassin's Creed company, and they used to actually just kind of do other people's work for them, like IDOS in this case. I do think that the segmented, individual puzzle nature of this game really does lend itself a little bit better to handheld gameplay sessions, so if you're not averse to downloading it on an emulation device, or if you actually have a Game Boy Advance lying around, I'd recommend checking it out and trying to find a cart because it could be fun for 10 to 15 minutes at a time. I do find myself wanting to go back to it and playing it for a couple minutes every now and again. It's just really not suited for long play sessions. It kind of reminds me in that way of Lara Croft Go, where it does give you that little boost of tomb raiding, but only in really short bursts. The next and last Tomb Raider game for the Game Boy Advance is Tomb Raider Legend, developed by Crystal Dynamics and released in 2006. This is definitely towards the end of the Game Boy Advance lifecycle, and you can tell because of how much connective tissue this game has to the Nintendo DS version, which we'll get to in a minute. Because played back to back, these games are absolutely fascinating. Legend basically ditches any of the isometric stuff that was in the Prophecy and goes back to the formula of the original Game Boy Color games. It's a 2D side-scroller with some platforming, but it also tries to innovate and bring in some of the stuff Legend brought to the table, like a grappling hook that you can use to move around objects in the environment, and some puzzles revolving around pushing things onto teeter-totters. The game does suffer a little bit from that grimy Game Boy Advance look, but the sprite work for Lara herself is actually pretty good, and I think it's a little bit better that you can't really see all of her assets so much. The action itself is pretty basic, and there are a couple collectibles to hit here and there, but mostly this is a good continuation of what started on the Game Boy Color. Doesn't do too much new, but it definitely gives you that Tomb Raider experience that you want on the go. I'm just kind of not sure who this was for at the time. I mean, as we'll talk about in a second, the Nintendo DS was already out, and this game actually launched a couple months after the other console versions, so if you had already played those, I guess if you were a massive Tomb Raider fan, you would pick it up on the Game Boy Advance. I don't know, it's weird. It was a wild time for Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS ports. But despite kind of feeling like an afterthought on the market, it plays pretty okay and is actually maybe the best handheld Tomb Raider game out there. I had a lot of fun checking it out, and I've actually gone back to it a couple times because the puzzles are simple, the action isn't too hard, and the checkpoints are actually fairly forgiving. But like I said, the most interesting thing about Tomb Raider Legend on the Game Boy Advance might actually be its connection to Tomb Raider Legend on the Nintendo DS. Also developed by Crystal Dynamics and released in 2006, this game is so friggin' weird and is everything awesome and bizarre about the early DS years. And playing it and the Game Boy Advance version back to back just shows that, because they're almost the same game, but they play like a remake and a demake of one another. You can definitely see it in the opening levels where there is a lot of similar architecture and even some similar moments and traps. For example, a giant rock that comes after you and some boulders that you can shoot to fall on enemies after they roll down a hill. But what's really fascinating is that unlike some other Nintendo DS ports, this doesn't just port the Game Boy Advance version over and spruce up the graphics a little bit. This is an entirely original game for the system that uses its own 3D engine and has 2.5D movement on a 2D plane, which is kind of awesome. It manages to give you a little bit more freedom over Lara's movement while still kind of holding true to the original spirit of the Game Boy Color games, and allows you to do things like grappling, swinging on vines with increased depth to the environment, so it just kind of feels more like an actual adventure. The graphics are a little bit muddy nowadays, and it could look better overall, but I also really want to talk about the combat here, because it's the most bananas combat I've ever seen in a DS action game. Playing it on an emulator, I didn't think I would actually need to use the screen, so I kept putting it just on the top LCD. But when I would get near an enemy, I would see a targeting reticle, and the screen would go dark, and I couldn't figure out why I wouldn't hit the enemy. When I popped it into a dual screen view, I figured it out. You actually have to shoot the enemy in first person on the bottom screen using the DS stylus. That's the way combat was originally meant to pan out, and I don't know why they decided to go with this. You're already near an enemy, you can be shooting them at point-blank range, and it still won't hit them if you're not aiming using the DS touchpad. And the bottom first-person sections don't even look that good. The bad guys are just kind of these sprites wobbling around in this hazy void that looks like Lara just got her eyes dilated and can't see who's coming towards her. It kind of reminds me of the zombie section in Resident Evil Gaiden on the original Game Boy Color. And once you get the hang of it, it's honestly not that bad. In fact, it's kind of a little bit too easy, because instead of just dodging, you can stand far away and pinpoint your shots as many times as you need, because you're literally pinpointing them with the stylus. It's such a strange solution to combat, and it definitely is something that could only have happened and come about during the early days of the DS, when every single developer needed to find a way to use its unique functions. I mean, in hindsight, looking at the times, I guess we should be glad that the Nintendo Touch features were this and not something related to actually touching Lara. I regret I even gave someone that idea. Tomb Raider Legend got pretty mediocre to middling reviews when it came out, citing the graphics and the weird controls and some of the frustrating spikes in difficulty. But honestly, I had a lot of fun just playing it for about 2 to 3 hours, getting to the next couple levels and turning it off. It's really only good as a curiosity nowadays, and if you had to choose between the two versions, I'd honestly go with the Game Boy Advance version. It's more fun, it's simpler to play, and although you are missing out on a pretty incredible gimmicky combat system, it doesn't add much to the overall experience. Which brings us finally to the last handheld game in the Tomb Raider franchise for now. The Nintendo DS port of Tomb Raider Underworld. Developed once again in-house by Crystal Dynamics, Underworld puts the player back on a strictly 2D plane, so there's no 2.5D movement, which is kind of a bummer. But all of the environments are actually fully realized in 3D this time, as is Lara, as opposed to her 2D sprite compilation that made up her character in Tomb Raider Legend. And for the most part, this is a pretty big improvement over everything in Tomb Raider Legend. The annoying, weird, gimmicky combat is gone, though it has been replaced by some gimmicky touchscreen puzzle sequences, but what do you want? It was the fashion of the day, let's say. And it adds to the game's pretty impressive gameplay variety, which does include some of the underwater sequences among plenty of different weapons and abilities. It also has some hilarious attempts at infusing the console game's story onto the Nintendo DS, which just mostly consists of a lot of really, really compressed 3D video that, man, has not aged well. And blowing this game up on a screen, speaking of not aging well, it doesn't really look like much today, but considering the time, this game actually made some pretty good use of the Nintendo DS's 3D technology and is pretty impressive for what it's trying to pull off. It is basically the full realized version of Tomb Raider Underworld, of course, with some concessions put onto the Nintendo DS. It kind of feels like the full realization of what Core Design set out to do with that original Game Boy Color duology way back in the early 2000s. Still, it's not really doing anything new with the franchise, not really putting any new spins or directions on it, and does just follow the console game, so if you were going to play a version of this when it released, you probably would have been better off just playing it on Xbox 360 or PS3. The puzzles aren't really anything to write home about, and the combat is about as basic as you can get. Some of the platforming can be pretty fun, and there are a couple thrilling close calls, but for the most part, this is the bare bones of what you would want out of a Tomb Raider experience on a handheld. So it's okay, I guess? It's fine. There you go, there's a game quote for you. Slap it on the box. That's for your marketing team. Which also brings us to the end of our Tomb Raiding journey here. While there were a couple other ports of games, especially on the PSP, like Tomb Raider Anniversary and Tomb Raider Legend, those games were basically just full-on remakes of the original console games, so I don't really count them as original creations. There have been a couple series spin-offs on mobile, like Lara Croft's Relic Run, which is basically just a Temple Run clone, and Lara Croft Go, which I believe did come to the PlayStation Vita, but again, seeing as how those are straight ports of games made for other templates, I don't really count them among these weird offshoots. But still, tracking these fairly underrepresented and unknown adventures for Lara Croft from the early 2000s all the way through to the series reboot has been a fascinating look at not just how the series evolved, but how games on handheld evolved over such a short period of time. From bizarre thinking outside the box innovations from Core, like making Lara's sprite twice as tall so you could pack in more animations, to just bonkers gimmicks like a first-person combat system in a 2D action shooter. It's a side series unto itself for one of the biggest and most important franchises in gaming. Sometimes they played it safe, sometimes they thought outside the box, but in their own way, each of these Tomb Raider games is kinda worth revisiting as a historical relic in its own right, even if they don't necessarily hold up today.